Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today we'll be looking at the second half of 1991, with releases by Smart Systems, Mental Cube, Candies, and the future sound of London. Smart Systems, the Tingler remix. After a run of EPs allowing them to indulge their fat lazy concept album band dreams, Dougans and Cobain returned to singles to expand on the most popular track from their previous release, Pulse 3's Tingler. The full-on hardcore track was given a radical reworking, removing the breakbeats and stabs, creating a Hoover-led intense techno track in the process. This mix appeared in two forms, a largely instrumental version, and one featuring a rap by friend of the band, Hamish MacDonald, who appears credited as H. MacDonald came from a post-punk goth background, formerly leading UK goth band Sexbeat and DJing at London's famous Batcave nightclub. He, like many former punks, became involved in underground dance music in the late 80s and worked with FSOL occasionally over the years, even being credited as a co-conspirator on the original EBV website. The single was completed with the inclusion of the original Pulse 3 version, renamed from 4x4 Mix to Stateside Swamp Mix for reasons. Tingler has gone to be one of the best known and most fondly remembered early 12 inches by the band, a third version of the remix appearing on Earthbeat, simply titled Tingler Remix, and then being reissued in 2008 to promote the release of the Pulse EPs backed with new remixes. The front cover is another monochrome buggy image, but this time red and black, or purple and black on a certain number of copies, with numerous logos including a new Smart Systems icon and for the first time a Future Sound of London logo with the band name above a Pulse 3 style star. This would soon be replaced with the more widely used pyramid logo, but its appearance is another step towards bringing FSOL forward as their favourite alias. As with other releases from the era, the sleeve and labels contradict each other in terms of credits. The back cover cites FSOL as producing and engineering the track, while the records credit Mental Cube for production and, for the first time in ages, Yage as engineer, a role the name would take for most releases going forward. Removing the breakbeats and stabs from the original, the Meltram mix of Tingler reinvents the track as a piece of intense industrial techno. Many of the hardcore staples are still there: whistles, crowds, vocal samples, chanting go go go, and of course the Hoover synths, which lead the track on this version, but the resulting piece is very different in feel. It was for some time the version of the track that many FSOL fans knew best, due to a very similar version, featuring an additional rap verse, appearing on Earthbeat. The rap includes some fairly rudimentary cyberpunk imagery, techno overload in a city of the future decode, as well as an invitation for listeners to come down to the future sound of London, and has probably dated as badly as anything the group have ever worked on. The track is loaded with other vocal samples, including the aforementioned Go 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 chant, a wailing diva, someone yelling London, and an electronic voice stating Smart Systems Tingler reactivated. Cheesy as it all may sound, it gives an idea of just how many ideas there are in the track. The Meltram mix, like its rapless cousin the Mingler mix, is an incredibly dense slab of sound, with just tons of stuff happening throughout, another testament to the pair's increasing skills in arranging and production. The main synth riff would go on to be sampled many times over the following year. Check out Nam's Recycler, Venom's Total Recall, and Lost in Hell by Adam X. As with all versions of the track, it samples the From My Dreams So Beautiful dialogue from the movie Dune. As stated, the Mingler mix is basically the Meltram mix without Hamish MacDonald's rap. The arrangement is otherwise identical. This leads to it sounding slightly more repetitive, with the rap sections feeling a touch empty. At the same time, a lot of people dislike the rap, meaning this version is ideal for them. All the other vocal samples are present. Around the time of Tingler's release, the band also played a PA in Cornwall. Playing live on stage was never part of the FSOL story. With the advent of ISDN, Dougans and Cobain found a way to put out the equivalent of a live performance on their own terms, in a way which suited their music and its purposes. In the early days, however, this philosophy was less concrete, and they experimented with touching the audience on a few occasions. For some time, the only known date was the Mental Cube and Humanoid DJ slot supporting Guru Josh in December 1990. However, in 2017, another show came to light as the result of the first ramblings of a Madman zine. In it, a story entitled Touching the Audience recounts a PA the pair performed with Hamish MacDonald and Graham Gardner in 1991, somewhere in Cornwall. As with most of the stories in the Ramblings books, the event was a shambles, but one with a lot of humour to mine. Ravers high on drugs were currently being mind-blown by the rave acts miming to their records, and oh my god, Ping wanted in. PAs were, as stated, largely mimed performances in place of standard DJ slots, usually with live vocals. For their trip to Cornwall, at the height of Smart System's popularity, they decided to play Tingler. Garry recounts the performance. From the opening bars of the Tingler with its distinctive Hoover sound, the crowd went wild. Pin wanked 101 like there was no tomorrow, and H was imperious. Get hyped to the Tingler remix, to the future sound of London, sounding like that curious blend of Mr. C meets Frank Spencer, beset by a Hoover on E. The groupies stuck out their breasts at the side of the stage, Graham gleaned, Pin was touching the audience, it felt great. Pin, as in most of the stories, represents Garry, and his characteristic 90s cynicism rears its head shortly afterwards. Pin had decided that one track was what they got for £100, pure Pin economics. The promoters rushed backstage. Great, the crowd love it, but go and play more. No, we've only bought one song. Things turned nasty, bouncers were called. Unsurprisingly, no footage of the PA exists online, and the only record of its existence is the amusing tale recounted in the zine. Brian recalls a voice behind him saying how embarrassing at the end of the performance. Years later, it turned out this voice was none other than Richard D. James, who'd been on stage immediately before, performing his classic Didgeridoo. This moment has haunted Brian to this day. Mental Cube, So This Is Love. After a run of increasingly popular techno and hardcore releases on Jumpin' and Pumpin', Brian and Garry returned to debut for the housey So This Is Love single. The first new Mental Cube material to be released since the hugely popular debut EP, So This Is Love is actually strikingly different from any of those first three tracks. Much more at home on debut than J&P, the release is one of a couple of house numbers the group released in mid-91, highlighting their continued eagerness to experiment. This exploration continued with the pair relocating to New York to record a couple of remixes. Made at Square Base Studios and mixed further afield in Santa Monica, California, the two rare outings away from Earthbeat were compiled to make up the 12 inches B-side. One of these, the Santa Monica mix of Q, undoubtedly helped sales of the single as the track had proved hugely popular. The mix would go on to be released on the Q singles licensed to France and Belgium. Boogie's cover, striking with its warning stripes, moves away from his usual blocky lettering, employing something similar to what would become the standard FSOL font from the Virgin era onwards. He also throws in the phrase "pretty brutal" on the back cover, alongside the now familiar Freaky Deek and Earthbeat logos. Garry is once again back to Cobain on the sleeve. FSOL are producers. The Neo Neo mix is simply listed as Neo Neo on the label. After a run of releases on which Dougans and Cobain flexed their UK hardcore and Detroit techno muscles, So This Is Love sounds strange. A very convincing slice of early 90s house, complete with jazzy synthpads, piano chords, female vocal samples and a gentle rolling breakbeat, the track is surprisingly mellow and sensuous, coming from the band who just released Tingler. As Garry explained to Music Technology magazine in 1992, the fact that we work under different names allows us to assimilate styles from other people. Basically, those other names enable us to research the way that other people are putting tracks together. They clearly researched well, as So This Is Love is, although far from original, a really great slice of laid-back house music that is very fondly remembered. The dreamy mood has always sat well with me, and the song has been a personal favourite of their early tracks. A much simpler piece than some of their contemporary tracks, it nevertheless shows off the band's increasing interest in sampling, with numerous vocal elements, including a recording of Sue Bowen, the girlfriend of one of Garry's friends, recorded at their flat. So This Is Love, Neo Neo mix. Most of the original elements of the track are present, but the rhythm is pretty different. The original's breaks appear briefly, but the main rhythm is in the form of a jazz sampling 4-to-the-floor loop with an odd double bass sampling bass line. It's an interesting choice. The original track is of course pretty jazzy, but one that ultimately doesn't quite pay off. The bass line especially seems very much at odds with the rest of the track. Q Santa Monica Mix. On this remix of Q, the strings sound shriller and more synthetic, and there are added bleeps of a more twinkly variety, bringing the track closer to the style that was becoming trance at the time, rather than the bleep techno of the original. The remix has its detractors and fans, largely depending on their stylistic preferences. For a while I absolutely loved this remix, preferring it to the original, but now, older and wiser, I find it a bit much, and would take the beefier sound and subtler arrangement of the original. The spoken Q sample is a nice touch though. Being made in 1991, the remix is credited to the Future Sound of London. However, the 1992 French Q 12-inch simply credits them as The Future, as part of an ongoing series of typos and errors on licensed FSOL releases. In 2023, So This Is Love became part of the ongoing series of early release reissues, with a straightforward repressing of the 12-inch and an expanded digital release. Candies, You Took My Love. Following a series of releases using established names, Brian and Garry returned to the one-off alias approach for their fifth and final release on debut. As with the previous 12-inch, the So This Is Love single, the You Took My Love EP finds the duo working within house music territory. The main song, its remixes, and the two additional tracks on the EP are all very housey, which is quite a strange direction for the band, especially given Cobain's assertion in 1994 that he always hated house music because it came from the soul generation, an era he was totally disconnected from. Some sense might be made of it when considering Brian's explanation in a 1994 Mixmag interview. Before we could listen to the radio, focus on what was selling, knock something up in that area and make money on it. We were trying to make a living. Perhaps then we can see the EP as a slightly cynical moneymaker. If so, it's testament to the pair's increasing production skill that 5 tracks knocked out quickly for cash are so well made, sounding as danceable and slick as much of the best UK house material of the time, indeed relying less on the generic piano sounds of the era, and for the most part this EP has dated far better than many of its contemporaries. Pete Tong was a particular fan at the time. The cover is standard 1991 buggy fare, a human face, looking much like one of those seen throughout Eurotechno, with the now characteristic block lettering. The rear sleeve omits the Freaky Deak logo, while the Earthbeat logo is present, albeit with some oddly off-centre lettering. The technical credits are all given to FSOL, with Yage missing once again. You Took My Love Earth Mix. With multiple female vocalists, sax samples and jazzy chords, You Took My Love is a straight-up 1991 house track. Not a style one would normally associate with this era of FSOL, but one they seemingly approach with the same level of attention to detail as their other works. While apparently straightforward on the surface, closer listens reveal numerous synth lines introduced throughout the track, inventively cut up and sampled, as well as several vocal tracks. The rhythm is largely breakbeat-led, in keeping with their general 1991 sound. You Took My Love is unlikely to be many fans' favourite early track, but it's a fine example of the style they chose to work in for this brief period. As with many of their other 1991 releases, the original version is referred to by a mixed name, this time Earth Mix, before being listed as simply You Took My Love on the Earthbeat compilation. You Took My Love New Yorker Mix. Effectively an alternative take. Unlike most of the group's self-remixed tracks, this version offers comparatively little new. It's slightly less busy with a more laid-back vibe, only really the rhythm track varying, with the breakbeats largely replaced by drum machines. Depending on your beat preference, this might work better or worse. For me, the shorter runtime of the original works better, as the extra minute here makes the mix overstay its welcome a touch. You Took My Love Instrumental. A misleading title for 2 reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, this version of You Took My Love isn't instrumental. A couple of vocal elements remain, most notably the repeated yeah phrase. More unusually, the track is structured very differently to the original, quite possibly to emphasise parts of the track which work better without the main vocals. A screenshot comparing the 2 versions, the Earth Mix and instrumental, is on screen now. It's Taken Me Over. A short track on the B-side of the You Took My Love EP, It's Taken Me Over is moodier and more clearly minor key than the other 4 tracks. Running to just over 2 minutes and based largely around a single drum loop, 4 chords and the titular vocal sample, the song feels more like a sketch released to round out the EP, much in the way that Dope Module did the previous year. I've always been strangely fond of the track, probably the very pretty chord sequence, but on the whole it's taken me over as one of the most inconsequential tracks in the entire Dougans Cobain oeuvre. I Need Somebody. The EP concludes on a punchy, catchy house number that is the polar opposite of its direct predecessor. Featuring a number of the same saxophone samples as You Took My Love itself, it clearly grew out of the same recording sessions. Organ and piano lines root it deeply within the house sound of the time, while the straight 4-to-the-floor beats differentiate it from the rest of the EP. A brief 303 line is the only obvious nod to the pair's roots in acid house and techno. In some ways, You Took My Love marks the end of this era of the Dougans Cobain story, the last record they would release on their original home debut, and the last major release before Papua New Guinea. By this point, most of the band's tracks were beginning to make serious indents on the club charts, some of them getting very high. DJ response sheets, which help make up these charts, featured routinely positive responses, and Pete Tong began to play tracks on Radio 1. Jumpin' and Pumpin' could see some serious momentum and brought in a press officer to push the band to various publications. This press pack was a collection of clippings and it was growing in size. They even covered the studio wall with release covers and press clippings. This time they started being visited by various record companies, Sony, Virgin, London, BMG, and they all enjoyed the art installation on the walls, impressed by the number of tracks that the band had done and the number that they actually recognised. Among these was an A&R man from Virgin called Rob Manley. Tim Jones was still in the circle and had begun speaking to managers and contacts. Brian and Garry were invited out for a drink with Matt Aitken of Stock Aitken and Waterman fame. They went out for food, went back to Matt's house, had a chat, a good time. They could even have pushed a deal with Stock Aitken Waterman, who had recently worked with Cabaret Voltaire. Jones also connected the group with a management company called Freedom Management, who ended up being the group's management company and are still to this day. Martin from Freedom immediately reached out to contact A&R people at the labels he'd visited to grow hype for the band. Colin Dale and other DJs were playing the group's songs on Kiss FM. The tracks were appearing in buzz charts, hype charts, record mirror charts. Interviews and reviews were appearing more and more regularly in the music press. In the space of a year, Brian and Garry had gone from just another pair of anonymous techno producers to one of the hottest names in UK dance music. It was only a matter of time before something tipped them over the edge. That something was a track called Papua New Guinea, the first proper release by the Future Sound of London. As fans, we often picture the Passion Music Alias of the Week era as being spread fairly evenly over the 1990 to 1992 era, but the real bulk of the story takes place in 91, a year that started with the first Pulse EP and ended with this track, the one that would go on to usher international success and lead them to depart Jumpin' and Pumpin'. The track was Papua New Guinea, although it wouldn't be until several months after its initial release that the world at large would catch up. The first pressing was already delayed, originally given a catalogue number 12-17, one before May's Tingler release. J&P were largely a hardcore label, and while the band's Smart Systems and Indo Tribe material fit right in, outliers like Papua New Guinea were treated with some suspicion, much like the melodic techno of early release Principles of Motion. We actually had problems getting the record company to even bring it out, Garry revealed in 1992. Eventually, a promoter for the J&P Passion group, Darren, pushed the label to release the track, recognising its originality. Darren, the head of club promotions at the label, alongside Anne, the press representative, worked very hard on breaking the band, and this was the moment that it happened. Initial plans to put the track out as Mental Cube were quickly scrapped. In Garry's words, up to this point Mental Cube had been selling well and Jumpin' and Pumpin' were getting touchy and protective about the name. They didn't understand Papua, thought it was shite and therefore didn't want it as a Mental Cube track. Although this decision was agreed upon by the band themselves, who realised that Papua's futuristic exoticism and ambient textures were the perfect fit for their own pet project, the Future Sound of London. Indeed, Garry favoured the FSOL name from the start, with Brian being more keen on Mental Cube. At this point, FSOL tracks had only been released on the first two Pulse EPs, and 3 of those were light years ahead of their other 1991 material in terms of sampling and production complexity. In hindsight, it seems bizarre to think that any other alias would have been right for Papua. In Garry's words, the Future Sound of London is our left-of-field stuff that we risk getting trashed for on every release. This time, it seems the risk paid off. Up until now, the pair's releases had largely adopted the same kind of cyberpunk imagery as most UK hardcore of the time: blocky fonts, futuristic pixelated graphics, titles either sciencey, Critical Ebb or Pulse State, or unnecessarily aggressive bite-the-bullet baby visual attack. Tracks themselves largely bleepy techno, Hoover-led rave or futuristic house. Everything about Papua New Guinea was different, from the conga loops, flute melodies, ethereal female vocals and atmospheric synth pads, to the exotic title and tribal-looking mask at the cover. The decision to make something so distant from the British rave scene was at least somewhat deliberate, as Garry related on the EBV website. We'd never been to Papua New Guinea, in fact we'd both been hardly anywhere. It suddenly occurred to us that we could go to Papua and collect DAT recordings, but in a way this was in itself now tradition, a way of enhancing the story, enhancing ourselves, making ourselves look worldly, providers of experience and anecdote. Why not sit at home and save time? Obviously this has a personal price. We missed out on the experience of life and people, but at the same time we were just interested in the end result, and the end result had the flavour of Papua and no further relation. The title itself was inspired by the Cocteau twins' Akai Guinea, the Cocteaus being Garry's all-time favourite band. Many of the unconventional sounds came from sampling, of course. The band's subtle use of samples had been increasing over the previous 12 months and hit a new peak here. Garry explained to The Guardian in 2015, "We didn't feel like we could work with exotic musicians, but we wanted to bring that level of depth into the sampling, which was the ability of two skint boys in their early 20s to seem exotic and worldly without asking anybody's permission." After a period of releasing EPs, Dougans and Cobain clearly felt more confident in tracks again, not surprising with the track as strong as Papua. After going through a period of knocking out tracks left, right and centre, far more time was spent on Papua, the pair spending almost a week working on the 3-track 12-inch. For the final time, the original version was given a mix name, the Dali mix, which will go on to be known as the 12-inch original for the rest of their career. The B-side features two alternative versions, including a largely ambient version of the track, Dumb Child of Q, and the earlier acidic Cube mix, which remains an exclusive track to this 12-inch to this day. Although clearly a product of its time, and structurally not so far away from something like You Took My Love, the cover is quite different from the rest of Boogie's 1991 work. Indeed, the picture itself dates back to Nicoline's earlier work in the 80s. The usual blocky fonts are replaced with a much simpler, more readable sans serif typeface, and the now iconic mask image features comparatively little digital alteration. Only really the cover's monochrome nature connects it with previous J&P releases. The credits get another shake-up, with Yage returning as engineer and, at this point, producer, while Tim Jones is once again given an executive producer role. The Freaky Deak and Earthbeat logos are both present and correct. Despite the label's lack of belief in the track, Papua New Guinea sold very well, with the burgeoning ambient house scene providing sonic relief from the onslaught of rave thanks to the KLF and the Orb. Dance music listeners of the time were increasingly interested in sounds from the wider world of electronic music, and Papua came along at the perfect time. The initial pressing sold out quickly, with second-hand copies being traded for unheard-of sums. Realising the commercial potential in the track, Brian and Garry waited until they had a new set of remixes before allowing it to be reissued. In the interim, Jumpin' and Pumpin' finally released the long-overdue Accelerator album to keep the track on the market. But those are both stories for another video. In October 2003, this 3-track edition was issued on S12, Simply Vinyl's Dance 12-inch imprint. Papua New Guinea Dali Mix, also known as Papua New Guinea Original Mix, Papua New Guinea 12-inch version, Papua New Guinea Original. I remember hearing Papua New Guinea for the first time. I previously only heard the My Kingdom single and had no idea what to expect from a track released what seemed at the time as many years before. I liked it a lot, but it felt strangely lacking in the atmosphere and broad range of instruments that My Kingdom had. Of course, at the age of 12 I had no idea about the history of the band or indeed the evolution of electronic music throughout the 90s. And yet at the same time I managed to hone in on what is probably the most common opinion of the track among FSOL fans. Papua New Guinea's brilliance is hard to ignore, but it only feels like an early draft of the real sonic depth they would go on to achieve after leaving Jumpin' and Pumpin'. I've been dreading this entry because what can you really say about a track like Papua New Guinea? From a musical perspective, it was considered a landmark in experimental techno, fusing together breakbeats, ambient, dub and techno, although Garry would refute the T-word in 1992, asking, "What is techno?" when faced with the term. Over the years, I've seen the track described as everything from ambient dub and progressive trance to world beat and tribal techno, and while all of those terms have some accuracy to them, the truth is that Papua New Guinea never really fit comfortably into any category. It's clearly rooted in, and gained huge success from, club music. and yet it was written as an intentional way of creating an evocative, exotic soundscape. The heavy use of samples, none credited, although Meat Beat Manifesto's Radio Babylon is openly acknowledged as the source of the bass line. There was nothing wrong back then with having a little bit of a familiar bass line, and the Babylon bass line was one of the greatest within that culture, as Garry told Sound on Sound in 1996. And of course Lisa Gerrard's vocal, sampled from Dead Can Dance's Dawn of the Iconoclast, is well known, despite some early playing down of it. It's me through a pitch harmoniser. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Who knows? Could be, as Garry stated to Echoes in 1994. This is potentially what lifts it above breakbeat techno of the era. As Garry told Sound on Sound magazine, maybe Papua New Guinea was the first time that sampling really went there. We were taking from a very exotic sound base and we were using samples in quite a different way. Brian was schooled in quite a lot of stuff, and I think his sound techniques really came together at that point. Gerrard's soaring ethereal voice is otherworldly, while flutes and congas throw in a tribal vibe. Other sounds, the oft-quoted Seagull, actually Brian's JX3P, one of several samples from his Z-Box era recordings, the yearning piano line, and of course the beautiful gated pads, would feel more at home on an ambient record than something designed for dancing. Because of the track's huge popularity, it's the one individual piece we know the most about, and a lot of that from a wonderfully revealing interview with Sound on Sound in 2006. The article includes an enormous amount of detail about how it was created, covering everything from the back and forths between the pair of them to the specific bits of kit utilised for each sound. It's a recommended read to anyone interested in the band, especially those who create electronic music themselves. Now, I shan't recount too many details here, but there's a link below the video. In short, the piece began as a collection of sounds collated by Brian. Brian is very good at collecting a palette of sound that is going to work in terms of the mix. He collects very much on a top, middle and bass production level, and he collected this great chord. There's no way in hell I'd ever work out how to do that, it's just not my bag. Which was then used by Garry to create a track. The first pass was deemed shit, and passed on to Brian, who added breaks and removed the bass line. The track went back and forth between them until the final mix was created. This early version was the Cube mix, and later on in the week the track was reworked into the Dumb Child of Q ambient mix. The interview also includes a wonderful anecdote about the original source of the Lisa Gerrard sample. Garry had been unfaithful on his girlfriend, so she retaliated by doing the same with a Dead Can Dance fan. She continued to receive these rather puppy-doggish tapes of tracks that were lamenting his lost love. Well, on one of them was the Dead Can Dance song. I'd always loved Dead Can Dance, but I didn't have that particular album, so I sampled it from the cassette. Papua New Guinea has been remixed more times than it's worth counting, many of them terrible bootlegs using an unconvincing sample pack created by Future Music magazine in the 90s. It's featured on countless compilations, it's been cited as a milestone in dance music culture, and led directly to FSOL signing to Virgin in 1992. To this day it remains a favourite of dance music fans the world over, and if not a guaranteed contender for fan favourite, seems to be warmly embraced by both the group and their fans. Papua New Guinea Dumb Child of Q mix. Without the drums and some of the other samples, the Dumb Child of Q mix is a strangely haunting and much darker version of Papua New Guinea that actually does a better job of suggesting the band's future than the original. Indeed, for the album version, both the 12-inch mix and Dumb Child of Q mix are used together, suggesting, along with a recurring use of this mix on numerous compilations and reissues, that the group themselves are proud of it and align it with the ambient sound design approach they were developing at the time. Dumb Child of Q was among the early working titles for the track, before the Papua New Guinea idea came along, and although not their finest work, it's very evocative, and its reliance on atmosphere, its stripped back rhythm, only the kick remains, and the eerily pitch-shifted vocal sample in which Lisa Gerrard's voice is warped into something like a man, give it a creepy nocturnal feel. It's a great example of how the sometimes perceived stylistic cut-off point between the Passion and Virgin eras is far more blurred than people may think. Papua New Guinea Cube Mix. There's a mix of the song called Dumb Child of Q, it's on the 12-inch, and that's pretty much me writing, Garry Cobain incorrectly told Sound on Sound in 2006. However, that track wouldn't have done anything because it didn't have what it later had. Instead, Brian just sat back, waiting for me to exhaust, and then when that happened, he waded in with a whole bank of samples. He had some new drums, he gated the strings, and my god, it was sounding bloody massive. He revolutionised the sound. That version he's talking about is of course the Cube mix. and I've no idea why he refers to it as the dumb child of Q. It's pretty much the main reason the original 1991 12-inch of Papua New Guinea goes for much higher prices than their other JMP era singles, as it's never been reissued other than that 2003 Simply Vinyl pressing. While the similarly vinyl exclusive Monsoon mix from 1992 ended up on the 2001 Papua New Guinea remix anthology bundled with Accelerator, the Cube mix is a real FSOL rarity. It has a mid-heavy acidic bass line, the entirely different earlier drums, and many of the more atmospheric samples are missing. As such, it really does feel like the work in progress that it is. It's an early sketch, an idea for what the track could have been, a direction it could have taken, before Brian, in Garry's words, revolutionised it into the Papua New Guinea we know and love. The thicker bass line means the Dead Can Dance sample with its backing drone has almost the entire bottom end EQ'd out. Papua New Guinea ended 1991 on a high. 1992 would be an even more exciting year, with a big reissue of the song and a major label deal finally signed. Before I get to 92 though, there's a little bit of mopping up to do, with some 1991 miscellanea, reissues and remixes. Mental Cube Q. While ostensibly a B-side on 1990's Child of the Bass Generation EP, Q has gone on to be the most well-known of Dougans and Cobain's pre-Papua New Guinea tracks. The huge success of the track led to the original EP being given a quick turnaround second press, and unsurprisingly there was interest abroad to release it. Debut were happy to comply, first licensing it to Buzz, the dance imprint of Belgian pop label Indisc. This 12-inch is one of only a couple to feature the full 6-minute uncut version of the track, the second being the 1992 French release. Indeed, the original mix has only ever been released in the UK on the 2LP edition of 1991 compilation Jumpin' and Pumpin' Volume 1. The B-side features the Santa Monica mix, which also appeared around this time on So This Is Love. The cover features a reasonable computer graphic, a world away from Boogie's work, but much better than the dated monstrosity found on the 1992 reissue. A feature of FSOL's catalogue is the frequent misspelling of their names on licensed releases, and here Garry is credited as C. Cobain. Both tracks are listed as having runtimes of 4:12, despite this being a blatant error for the A-side. The original 6.5-minute version of Q is odd for not appearing on any release put together by Dougans and Cobain. Such is the way of things in the confusing world of FSOL. This is arguably the best mix of the track, not only because we get more Q, but because of the wonderful outro. Instead of fading out at 4:55, it continues on for almost 2 more minutes. The strings come back in again before everything cuts back to the drums and bass. What could simply be an extended outro designed to help DJs mix, as became exceedingly common for club mixes later in the 90s, becomes a breakdown as the strings return again in a lovely joyous moment as the track kicks in for a final round before the eventual fade out. While the 12-inch singles will set you back somewhere in the region of £200 according to Discogs, your best bet is the 2LP edition of Jumpin' and Pumpin' Volume 1, which appears every now and then for more sensible prices. It's worth noting that the CD and cassette editions of the compilation feature the 4-minute edit. 1991 remixes. With a number of successful releases under their belt, it was only a matter of time before Brian and Garry were signed up to provide remixes for other artists. Despite it being a busy year for their own material, they only produced 3 remixes in 1991. None of these really bears the hallmarks that gained the group a reputation for high quality remixes, and they just exist here rounding up a prolific year of creative growth for the band. Loleatta Holloway, Do That To Me, Set Me Free, Future Sound of London remix. The first ever FSOL remix, and unusually for this era, one released under the FSOL name. The track is actually a world away from the FSOL sound, even from something like Hardhead, with rave stabs, straightforward breakbeats and some unnecessary use of fairly bad rapping. Holloway was a gospel and disco singer who found international fame in the late 70s. Her work was commonly sampled in the late 80s, most prominently on the initial version of Black Box's Ride On Time, and as a result, a number of her older tracks were reissued with contemporary house and techno remixes. Debut was responsible for a UK release of Do That To Me, Set Me Free, also called Set Me Free, Do That To Me, as one might expect with anything FSOL related. And with Garry and Brian responsible for a number of the label's popular tracks at the time, they commissioned an FSOL remix. Holloway's vocals, singing "Do That To Me Now," is looped, and the only presence of her on the track. The very closing moments reuse a percussive whoosh sound from Bring In The Pulse. Sadly, it's dated incredibly badly and is by far my least favourite piece of music ever to use the Future Sound of London name. "100Hz Progress, People Living on Mars" mix. The band's second ever remix starts the trend of FSOL remixes that don't use the band name in the title. In this case, the People Living on Mars title comes from the vocal used throughout the track, albeit misquoted. The lyric is actually "People Living in Mars." With the pretty terrible vocal removed, it would actually be up there with some of the band's stronger 1991 material. Built around interplaying melancholic and ravey synth lines with fairly intense breakbeats and some tribal sounding loops, it sounds like a halfway point between earlier FSOL and Indo Tribe, and wouldn't be out of place on one of the Pulse EPs. Probably one of the best remixes from this era of the band. One of the breakbeats used later reappeared on the Smart Systems remix of Nomad's "Your Love Is Lifting Me." On the flip side to the excellent People Living on Mars mix of Progress is a slightly less excellent remix, possibly the most straightforward piece of dance music Brian and Garry ever released, the JX3P mix. There's some nice 303 action in there, but on the whole it feels like it was knocked off in a rush after they spent most of their allotted time on the People Living on Mars mix. The title comes from the Roland JX3P synth, one of which Brian had owned since the 1980s. Next time on Earthbeat Visions, I will be looking at the debut FSOL album, Accelerator, Yage's Fuzzy Logic EP, and the 1992 reissue of Papua New Guinea. Until then, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the material discussed in this video, and there are also like, subscribe and share buttons down there you might feel like pressing. And I'll see you next time!